November 14, 1947, 7:43 p.m. Madison Square Garden, New York City. Jake LaMotta, the Bronx Bull, stepped through the ropes for what should have been the biggest fight of his career. 16,000 fans packed the arena. Sports writers filled ringside. Radio announcers prepared to broadcast nationwide. LaMotta was facing Billy Fox, an undefeated light heavyweight with 43 wins and a glass jaw that shattered when you looked at it wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This was supposed to be easy money for LaMotta. Fox was moving up in weight. LaMotta was a middleweight destroyer who'd never been knocked down. The smart money was on LaMotta by knockout in 3 rounds. But as the opening bell rang, something was wrong. LaMotta threw lazy jabs. He dropped his guard. He backed against the ropes like a man who didn't want to be there. Then, in the 4th round, Billy Fox landed a weak left hook to LaMotta's ribs. LaMotta crumpled like he'd been shot. He hit the canvas, stayed down for the count, and lost the most obvious fixed fight in boxing history. 16,000 people knew they'd been robbed. Sports writers called it a disgrace. The New York State Athletic Commission launched an investigation. But Jake LaMotta walked away with something more valuable than a victory. He walked away with his family's lives. Because 3 weeks earlier, LaMotta had sat in a backroom restaurant in Brooklyn and been given a choice by men who didn't negotiate. Lose to Billy Fox, get your title shot. Refuse, and your wife and kids disappear forever. This isn't just the story of a fixed fight. This is the story of how the American Mafia controlled boxing for decades, turning champions into puppets and fixing outcomes worth millions. How they used family as leverage, fear as currency, and violence as the final arbitrator. From underground clubs in the Bronx to Madison Square Garden. From a working-class kid with fists like hammers to a broken champion who sold his soul to save the people he loved. But here's what the sports books never tell you. Jake LaMotta didn't just take a dive once. He threw multiple fights over his career, all on mob orders. He fought for 13 years before getting a title shot because the mob controlled who got opportunities. And when he finally became champion in 1949, it was only because he'd proven he could follow orders. His entire career was a mobster's business plan. His championship belt was bought with betrayal, and the price he paid haunts boxing to this day. Jake LaMotta was born Jacob LaMotta on July 10, 1922, in the Bronx. His parents, Joseph and Elizabeth, were Italian immigrants who'd come to America looking for something better than poverty. They found poverty in New York instead. The family lived in a cramped tenement on East 156th Street in the Bronx. 5 kids sharing 3 rooms. His father worked construction when there was work, which wasn't often during the Depression. His mother took in laundry to make ends meet. Jake was the middle child, small for his age, but with hands that felt like rocks when he made fists. The neighborhood was rough. Irish kids from one block, Italian kids from another, Puerto Rican families moving in from the south. Everyone fought everyone. Jake fought more than most. By age 10, he was coming home with bloody noses and black eyes every day. But he was winning more than he lost. The Bronx in the 1930s was controlled by organized crime. The Italian-American Mafia had crews throughout the borough. Numbers running, loan sharking, protection rackets. Young kids saw mobsters driving nice cars, wearing expensive suits, commanding respect. Jake noticed. He also noticed they were always talking about boxing, always betting on fights, always looking for the next angle. When Jake was 13, his father took him to a local gym on Westchester Avenue. It was run by an old Italian fighter named Mike Capriano, who'd been around the fight game for 30 years. Capriano took one look at Jake, 5 feet 8 inches, 140 pounds, with shoulders like a construction worker, and put him in the ring with a bigger kid. Jake demolished him in 90 seconds. Capriano saw something special: raw power, natural aggression, and the kind of hunger that couldn't be taught. Jake started training seriously. 5 days a week at the gym, road work before school, heavy bag work after school. By 16, he was sparring with professional fighters and holding his own. He had a style that would define him for life: aggressive, relentless, willing to take 2 punches to land 1 devastating shot. Opponents hurt him, but nobody stopped him. Nobody even knocked him down. In 1941, Jake turned professional. His first fight was at St. Nicholas Arena in Manhattan against a club fighter named Charlie Mackley. Jake knocked him out in the second round with a right hand that broke Mackley's jaw. The purse was $35. Jake gave his mother $20 and kept $15. It was more money than his father made in a week. But professional boxing in the 1940s wasn't about talent alone. It was about connections, management, and access. The mob controlled most of the major promoters, many of the venues, and a significant number of fighters. If you wanted big fights, title shots, main events at Madison Square Garden, you needed mob approval. Independent fighters could make a living in small clubs, but they'd never become champions. Jake LaMotta was about to learn that lesson. His early manager was Mike Capriano, the gym owner who discovered him. Capriano was honest, hardworking, and completely powerless in the fight business. He could get Jake local fights, small purses, and gradual improvements in opponents. But he couldn't get him the fights that mattered. For 2 years, Jake fought preliminary cards and club shows. He won most of them by knockout, but nobody important was watching. In 1943, everything changed when Jake met Salvatore "Fat Tony" Salerno. Salerno was a capo in the Genovese crime family, who controlled significant portions of the boxing racket in New York. He owned pieces of several fighters, had promoters on his payroll, and could arrange outcomes when necessary. Fat Tony watched Jake destroy an opponent at the Bronx Coliseum and saw opportunity. Salerno approached Jake after the fight. He was friendly, respectful. He complimented Jake's power, his heart, his potential. Then he made an offer. New management, better fights, bigger purses. All Jake had to do was sign a contract that gave Salerno's associates control over his career. Jake was 21 years old, making $200 a fight, supporting his mother and siblings. He signed. The change was immediate. Jake's new manager was a connected guy named Joe Attell who had relationships throughout the fight business. Better opponents, bigger venues, purses that jumped from $200 to $2,000 overnight. Jake was fighting main events at St. Nicholas Arena, co-main events at Madison Square Garden. He was being mentioned in the sports pages. His name was getting known, but there was a price. In Jake's fourth fight under the new management, against a fighter named Danny Russo, Jake was told to carry Russo for 8 rounds before knocking him out. The mob had betting interests that required a specific outcome. Jake followed orders. He dominated Russo, but let him stay upright until round 8, then finished him with a perfectly timed right hand. The mob made money. Jake got his purse plus a bonus. That's how it started. Not with dramatic threats or violence, but with business. Jake would get instructions before certain fights. Knock him out in round 6, not round 3. Win by decision, don't go for the knockout. Carry him for 10 rounds, then put him away. Jake complied because the alternative was going back to $35 paydays and fighting in church basements. By 1944, Jake LaMotta was one of the most exciting middleweights in boxing. He had 30 wins, 20 by knockout, and only 2 losses, both controversial decisions that many observers thought he'd won. He was selling out arenas throughout the Northeast. Sports writers were calling him a future champion. There was just one problem. He couldn't get a title shot. The middleweight championship was controlled by the International Boxing Club, a promotion company that was secretly owned by mobsters Frankie Carbo and Frank "Blinky" Palermo. They decided who fought for titles, when those fights happened, and often who won them. Jake LaMotta was the #1 contender, but Carbo and Palermo weren't interested in giving him a shot. Why? Because Jake's management team wasn't willing to guarantee the right outcome. This is where the story gets complicated. Jake wanted to be champion legitimately. He believed he could beat anyone in the division. His handlers, Fat Tony Salerno and Joe Attell, believed that too. But they also knew the business realities. If Jake became champion without mob approval, he'd face a series of hand-picked challengers designed to take the title away from him. Independent champions didn't last long in 1940s boxing. For 3 years, Jake fought everyone except the champion. He beat former title holders, top contenders, undefeated prospects. He demolished middleweights, light heavyweights, even some heavyweights. His record improved to 67-7. He was clearly the best fighter in his division who wasn't wearing a belt. But the title shot never came. During this period, Jake met and married Vicky Thaler, a young woman from the Bronx who worked as a hat-check girl in Manhattan nightclubs. They had their first child, a daughter named Stephanie, in 1946. Jake was now 24 years old, at his physical peak, and supporting a growing family. The pressure to secure his future was mounting. That's when Frankie Carbo made Jake an offer he couldn't refuse. November 1947. A backroom meeting at Villa Capri, an Italian restaurant in Brooklyn known for hosting mob sit-downs. Carbo was there with Frank Palermo and several associates. Jake came with Fat Tony Salerno. The conversation was friendly but direct. Carbo explained the situation. Billy Fox was an undefeated light heavyweight with a reputation for power but suspect chin. Fox was managed by Blinky Palermo, Carbo's partner. They wanted to move Fox up in weight for a big payday fight. Jake LaMotta was the perfect opponent, a named fighter, someone who would draw a crowd, someone whose defeat would establish Fox as a legitimate middleweight contender. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The deal was simple. Jake takes a dive against Fox, makes it look good, but goes down and stays down. The fight would be at Madison Square Garden, a big payday for everyone involved. In return, Jake gets his title shot within 18 months against whoever is champion. Guaranteed. Jake said he needed to think about it. That's when the conversation changed. Carbo leaned forward and spoke quietly. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a business decision that had already been made. Jake could cooperate and get his title shot, or he could refuse and never fight for a championship. Moreover, accidents happened in boxing. Fighters got hurt in training. Sometimes their families got hurt too. Jake's wife Vicky was beautiful. His daughter Stephanie was precious. It would be terrible if something happened to them. The threat was unmistakable. Jake looked at Fat Tony Salerno, his supposed protector. Salerno said nothing. Jake realized he was alone in this room with men who controlled his career and had just threatened his family. He agreed to the fix. The fight was scheduled for November 14, 1947 at Madison Square Garden. Jake had 6 weeks to prepare, both physically and mentally. Training was awkward because his regular sparring partners couldn't understand why he seemed distracted, why his punches lacked their usual viciousness, why he kept working on his defensive skills instead of his offense. Meanwhile, the betting line established Jake as a 4-1 favorite. Billy Fox was considered a setup fight, a showcase for LaMotta's power before a bigger opportunity. Mob money began flowing onto Fox at those generous odds. Carbo and Palermo stood to make over $250,000 if Fox won. That was serious money in 1947, equivalent to about $3 million today. Jake struggled with the decision. He'd spent his entire career proving he was the toughest fighter alive. Taking a dive went against everything he believed about himself. He considered backing out, telling Carbo to find another opponent. But every time he thought about refusing, he pictured Vicky and Stephanie. He thought about what these men were capable of. He'd heard stories about fighters who'd crossed the mob. They didn't just lose opportunities, they disappeared. 3 days before the fight, Jake had dinner with his wife at their apartment in the Bronx. Vicky could sense something was wrong. Jake was quiet, distant. She asked if he was nervous about the fight. Jake looked at her across the table, holding their baby daughter, and made his peace with what he had to do. He wasn't selling his soul. He was renting it to keep his family safe. November 14th arrived. Jake went through his usual pre-fight routine. Light breakfast, afternoon nap, quiet meditation. But everything felt different. As he walked to Madison Square Garden that evening, he wasn't preparing to win a fight. He was preparing to lose one convincingly. The crowd was electric. 16,212 fans packed the arena. Radio broadcasts carried the fight nationwide. Jake entered the ring to thunderous applause. He was the local favorite, the Bronx Bull, the blue-collar hero who represented everyone who'd ever worked for everything they had. They were cheering for a man who was about to betray them. Billy Fox entered to polite applause. He was 6 feet 1 inch, 175 pounds, with an unimpressive physique and a nervous demeanor. Sports writers noted he looked intimidated. They were right, but not for the reasons they thought. Fox knew this was a fixed fight too. He'd been told to land one good shot, and Jake would go down. But Fox was terrified he'd accidentally hurt LaMotta before the script played out. The opening round was awkward. Jake threw lazy jabs. Fox circled cautiously. Neither fighter committed to serious offense. Experienced fight observers at ringside began to sense something was wrong. Jake LaMotta never fought cautiously. His style was aggressive, relentless pressure. This looked like a man who didn't want to be there. Rounds 2 and 3 continued the charade. Jake landed light jabs, but nothing with power. Fox occasionally lunged forward with wild swings that missed by inches. The crowd grew restless. They'd paid to see the Bronx Bull destroy an overmatched opponent. Instead, they were watching two fighters dance around each other. Then came round 4. About 30 seconds into the round, Fox landed a weak left hook to Jake's ribs. It was the kind of punch that would normally bounce off LaMotta like he was wearing armor. Instead, Jake crumpled to the canvas like he'd been shot. He clutched his side, rolled around in apparent agony, and stayed down for the full 10 count. The crowd erupted in boos. They knew they'd been cheated. Sports writers at ringside looked at each other in disbelief. The punch that supposedly knocked out Jake LaMotta wouldn't have hurt a welterweight. This was the most obvious fix in boxing history, and it was happening at Madison Square Garden on national radio. But Jake LaMotta walked out of that ring with something more valuable than a victory. He walked out knowing his family was safe. The mob had gotten their money. Jake would get his title shot. The only cost was his integrity, and he decided that was a price worth paying. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. The New York State Athletic Commission suspended Jake's license pending investigation. Sports writers condemned the fight as a disgrace to boxing. Fans felt betrayed. The FBI opened a file on the fight as part of their ongoing investigation into mob control of boxing. But Jake kept quiet. When questioned by athletic commissioners, he insisted the punch had hurt him, that Fox had caught him in the right spot, that the knockout was legitimate. He knew the truth would be worse than the lie. Admitting the fix would end his career and put his family at risk. For 6 months, Jake couldn't fight in New York. His license was suspended while authorities investigated. He fought in other states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, but the big money fights were in New York. The suspension cost him thousands of dollars in potential earnings. But in May 1948, with no proof of a fix beyond the obvious, the commission reinstated his license. True to their word, Carbo and Palermo delivered Jake's title shot. Marcel Cerdan, the French-Algerian middleweight champion, agreed to defend his title against Jake. The fight was scheduled for June 16, 1949 at Detroit's Briggs Stadium. Jake had waited 8 years for this opportunity. It was finally happening because he'd been willing to lose when losing mattered most. The Cerdan fight was everything Jake had dreamed of. No fix, no instructions from mob handlers, just two great fighters in their prime. Jake dominated. His relentless pressure broke down Cerdan's boxing skills. In the 10th round, Jake landed a devastating right hand that sent Cerdan to the canvas. Cerdan's shoulders separated on impact. He couldn't continue. Jake LaMotta was finally champion of the world. The victory was everything Jake had imagined and nothing like he'd hoped. He'd achieved his dream, but the shadow of the Fox fight hung over everything. Sports writers mentioned the fixed fight in their stories about his championship. Fans wondered if this victory was legitimate or another mob setup. Jake knew he'd won fairly, but he also knew the path to this moment had been bought with betrayal. Jake's championship reign lasted 2 years and 3 months. He made 6 successful title defenses, all legitimate fights against worthy challengers. He fought Sugar Ray Robinson for the title and lost a brutal 13-round war that many consider one of the greatest fights in boxing history. Robinson stopped him in the 13th round, but Jake proved his championship had been earned with blood and courage, not just mob connections. After losing his title, Jake continued fighting for several more years. But the boxing landscape was changing. Federal investigations were exposing mob control of the sport. The Kefauver Committee, a Senate investigation into organized crime, was subpoenaing fighters, managers, and promoters. The old system that had controlled Jake's career was crumbling. In 1960, Jake received a subpoena to testify before a federal grand jury investigating corruption in boxing. He was 38 years old, retired from fighting, running a nightclub in Miami. The investigators had evidence about the Billy Fox fight, wiretaps, financial records, testimony from other witnesses who'd flipped. Jake's choice was simple: tell the truth or face perjury charges. On June 14, 1960, Jake LaMotta sat in a federal courthouse in New York and admitted what everyone had suspected for 13 years. He'd thrown the fight against Billy Fox. He'd been ordered to lose by mob-connected promoters. He'd taken a dive to secure his title shot. The fix had been real. The admission destroyed what remained of Jake's reputation. His championship was permanently tainted. Sports writers who'd celebrated his courage against Robinson now focused on his cowardice against Fox. The man who'd been known as the Bronx Bull became the fighter who'd sold out at Madison Square Garden. But Jake didn't regret his decision. Years later, in interviews and in his autobiography, he explained his reasoning. He'd been given an impossible choice: throw one fight or lose everything, including potentially his family's lives. He chose survival over integrity. As he famously said, "I didn't sell my soul. I rented it to keep my family breathing." The Billy Fox fight represents everything wrong with boxing in the 1940s and 1950s. Mob control was so complete that even the best fighters couldn't become champions without criminal approval. The sport was rigged not just in individual fights, but in the entire structure of opportunities. Talent meant nothing without connections. Courage meant nothing without cooperation. Jake LaMotta's story reveals the human cost of this corruption. He was a legitimate champion who earned his title through skill and determination. But the path to that championship required him to compromise everything he believed about himself as a fighter. The mob didn't just fix fights, they fixed fighters' lives, using family as leverage and fear as currency. The investigation that forced Jake's admission helped clean up boxing, but it took decades. The Federal Boxing Act of 1960 increased government oversight. The mob's control gradually weakened as federal prosecutions increased. By the 1970s, boxing was cleaner, though never completely clean. Jake LaMotta lived with his decision for the rest of his life. He died in 2017 at age 95, having spent 70 years answering questions about one fixed fight. He expressed regret about the betrayal of his fans, but never about protecting his family. In his mind, he'd made the only choice a father and husband could make when faced with impossible circumstances. The Billy Fox fight remains a dark moment in boxing history, but it also illuminates the reality of organized crime's control over professional sports. The mob didn't just run gambling and loan sharking. They ran entertainment, manipulating outcomes for financial gain while using violence to ensure compliance. Athletes became pawns in schemes worth millions of dollars. Jake LaMotta's championship belt sits in a boxing hall of fame, a symbol of a great fighter's achievement. But it's also a reminder that even the most honest victories can be built on compromised foundations. Jake earned his title in the ring against Marcel Cerdan, but he only got the opportunity because he'd lost his integrity against Billy Fox. The question isn't whether Jake LaMotta was a coward for taking a dive. The question is what choice he really had when men with guns threatened his family. In 1947, saying no to the mob wasn't an option for a working-class fighter with a wife and baby daughter. It was a death sentence. Jake LaMotta chose to live with shame rather than die with honor. He chose his family's safety over his own reputation. And for the rest of his life, he paid the price for that choice, knowing that sometimes survival requires sacrificing the very thing that makes life worth living. This is the untold story of Jake LaMotta's deal with the devil. Not the rise of a champion, but the compromise that made the championship possible. A reminder that in the world of organized crime, nobody wins clean. Everyone pays a price. And sometimes, the cost of victory is everything you believed about yourself. If you found this story compelling, hit subscribe. We release new documentaries about the dark side of sports and organized crime every week. Drop a comment below. Which story of corruption in sports should we investigate next? And remember, behind every fixed fight, there's a human being making an impossible choice between survival and integrity.